Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on our open source approach to Teams provisioning. My name is Peter Carson. I'll be presenting today. If you haven't attended one of my webinars before, welcome. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager and also Envision IT, located in Mississauga in Canada. Also an Office Apps and Services MVP. All my contact info is up on the screen here. And we are going to be sharing the deck after the session, so you can download that or view the recording for those folks that aren't able to join live through the session. So I'll go pretty brief on the background side. Sorry, for some reason I'm losing my, or I'm getting my desktop toolbar behind here. Let me just stop and restart here. Bear with me one sec. Nope, it's just going to keep doing that. Okay. Yeah, Extranet User Manager has been around for better part of beyond a decade, I guess now, focused on bringing people in outside of your organization, building a digital community. Although today we're going to be more focused inwardly on Teams and such, we will touch a little bit on the external scenario as part of that. But let me pause and turn off my camera feed, just so we can get a better view of the screen here. And I always do this. I set my entire picture live, which is not what I wanted. Let me try this again. Much better. Cool. I actually wanted to do this as one of the new Teams webinar features that they just released, but unfortunately they didn't keep to their word of honoring attendee privacy. So the problem is that for public webinars like this, everybody can see everybody else's contact information, emails, things like that. And I really wish they hadn't done that, because I'd much prefer to do that in that type of format. It's much more dynamic and interactive. There's actually a time delay lag on these live events, and I can't really do live interactions with audience members. But maybe we'll rattle Redmond's cage, see what they're going to do on that side, and future webinars will be able to do more interactive from that point of view. But for today, we've done the introductions. We're going to talk sort of generally about our Teams governance and templating solution, go through an overview of that, talk about technical updates, and we are going to get under the hood and kind of walk you through some of the technical bits around that. I had thought about actually doing a live installation, because that's obviously of great interest for a lot of folks through this. I don't think we're quite there right now, and there's some long-running processes that happen through that. So I think what I'll do following this session is over the next day or two, I'll do another recording and just do stop capture, sort of elapsed time, and skip those long pauses as it's doing things, and put together maybe a 10 or 15 minute overview of what the installation process looks like. But I will talk through a lot of it today and take you through that. And we'll also talk about new features and roadmap, so things that clients are funding and interesting ideas coming down the pipe. And as always, we're interested in ideas from anybody as part of that as well. We do have a Microsoft Forms poll up, so you can use the bit.ly link here. Logan, if you want to just chat that out to the Q&A, or maybe you have already if it's in the publish there. It is, thank you. Couple different questions on there. Actually, let me bring up the actual full form survey so we can have a look at that. So some general contact info at the front. This is sort of the main ask here. Different things we're going to be talking about in the webinar. If you want to, you can wait to later in the webinar if you're not really sure what some of these things are, and circle back and complete it from there. And if there's specific features that you'd be interested in terms of, it'd be cool if it did this or that, by all means, jot them into question number 4 from there. And we are respectful. You say, hey, don't follow up, not right now. We will respect that. But if you want some time to review, or you actually want to talk right away, by all means, let us know, and Logan will follow up appropriately from there. I have published everything up to GitHub, so I'm going to be sharing the link through that. So all that is there. If you want to have some help and guidance through that process, happy to do that. We're still pretty early days in wrapping everything up and packaging up. I literally published up to GitHub last night and this morning. So I haven't kicked the tires too much. We're going to be doing a number of internal deployments and client deployments over the next few weeks. We've had a number of clients who've been waiting for this release for far too long, so keen to get that going. But if you want to try it yourself, by all means, let us know, and we'll follow up with you and give you whatever support you need from that point of view as well. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. So why are we here? I mean, what's the business case that's driving this? Well, so everybody's aware COVID's kind of thrown the world for a loop over the last year and a half, and remote working has become the norm. And there's all, all the platforms, Zoom, GoToMeeting, Teams have all taken off and seen an explosion of adoption. And we're very focused on the team side as a Microsoft Gold partner. And a lot of this has been unplanned. We saw a lot of organizations that hadn't really dipped their toes into Teams at all before COVID, and then suddenly just got thrown right into it. So there's not a lot of consistency in terms of how it's been rolled out. Often, unfortunately, not a lot of planning around governance and who gets to request Teams and how do they get set up and how are they structured. It's important to have self-service, but if you just leave it wide open with no templates and no guidelines, it's going to be the Wild West, and everything's going to be all over the map. Now, at the end of the day, people don't like rules. They don't want to be forced to work in a certain way. But if you can have some consistency, if you've got templates and governance and process around this that says, hey, when somebody wants a team, maybe it doesn't need to be approved and it gets built in a particular way, and tabs and SharePoint sites get set up in a particular way, you're not forcing people to work that way. But not to offend people, people are lazy. So if you set things up in a particular way for them, the vast majority of people will just follow that pattern, and then you get some consistency across there. You're going to have outliers that say, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to take it in my own direction. That's okay. But what you're trying to do is address the vast majority that say, hey, I'm just going to take it the way you give it to me. And if you give it to me in a well-planned, templated manner, then that's going to work really well for me. So there's a number of options around that. There's two actually that we use predominantly ourselves with our client implementations. We obviously have our open source solution that I'm going to be talking about here today. I've given past webinars though, and we've actually deployed a solution called Orchestry out to a number of our clients as well. And we've got quite a few who are quite interested in it as well. What Orchestry builds, well and above beyond our open source solution is really the full lifecycle management. They've got similar features for creating what they call a workspace and templates around that, and request processes and approvals and such, much like our open source solution has. To be fair, theirs is a lot slicker. It's a commercial solution. You get what you pay for, and they've done a really slick job of pulling in the user experience and such on that. But they go beyond that into the whole, lifecycle management of how do you manage teams that aren't being used anymore? How do you shut them down, archive them, retain them from a records point of view? Archive the team's conversations, things like that we don't have in our open source solution, and we may never. I mean, there's obviously a need for commercial solutions out there. And there are other commercial solutions. I don't have the same sort of experience with them, but wanted to throw a few names out there, and these are live links to their sites if you want to have a look. ShareGate, we're a big fan of. We use ShareGate a lot for migration projects with their desktop product. They have a product called Apricot. ShareGate's always been of the mind that we don't want to do templates. We don't want to do a provisioning process. They're really, let people create what they want just out of the box with Microsoft, and Microsoft's actually doing a nice job of improving what they can do from a templating point of view. ShareGate's really about that lifecycle management piece that Orchestry does as well, to say, well, how do we figure out teams that are abandoned, that don't have people actively working in them, or that lack an owner? How do we identify those, put retention schedules and notifications such around that? AvePoint is probably more comparable to Orchestry, although I don't have direct experience. I don't know a lot about their products. They have both the provisioning side and the governance side. I mean, AvePoint historically has had a very rich ecosystem of products across SharePoint and Microsoft 365. Valo Teamwork is similar to Orchestry, more around the provisioning and the Teams directory side of things. And then Provision Point 365, I don't really know. It just came up in a Google search, but they have a similar concept to Orchestry as well from that perspective. So have a look around if you're thinking about a solution. there are commercial solutions. There's our open source stuff. There's probably other open source options out there as well. But let's dive into our, what we've done from an open source. That's really the focus for today's topic. So I've used this slide for a couple of years now. I mean, it's actually stayed pretty constant through here. What do we want from a solution requirements? Well, first and foremost, it has to be self-service. People have to be able to submit a request in some sort of way. And maybe you don't want any approvals, or maybe you only want approvals in certain situations, but we need to be able to support some sort of approval process in there. It has to be easily extensible and customizable for each org. Different organizations have different requirements, particularly around the templates, but also around the approvals process and how that needs to work. So that needs to be, very easy to extend from that point of view. And as much as possible, we want to leverage out of the box and then just add in customized site templates, Teams templates to that. We obviously need to support modern sites, Microsoft 365 groups, and most importantly, Microsoft Teams. And lastly, we wanted to keep it simple from a technology point of view. For a period of time, our solution had an Azure function that was a web API built in Visual Studio and had C# code behind it. We've gotten away from all that. We've ripped that out in this solution and really simplified things down. We're going hard into the no code, low code approach. Now, I wouldn't say PowerShell is either no code or low code, but we're actually using a lot of logic apps that I'll talk about in a minute as well for things around that. But the idea being that PowerShell is that if you're a Microsoft IT pro, you really should know PowerShell if you don't know it already. And if we can use that as the primary coding platform, it's something IT pros can easily get their heads around from that perspective and be able to extend and support it within their organization. So from a supporting technologies point of view, I'll get into more detail, but Azure Logic Apps, SharePoint, and PowerShell running under Azure Automation are really the key components that we have going on here. So when somebody requests a team, what happens? Well, you get a number of components as part of that. Underneath the team, there's always a Microsoft 365 group, which is an Azure AD group, and the owners of the team are owners of that group, and members of the team are members of the group. And you can actually use that. I should put another Azure AD icon in here. You can use those security groups for other purposes within your organization. Now you also get a modern team site in SharePoint as part of that. You get a OneNote notebook that gets created underneath that SharePoint site. Optionally, you get a planner plan as part of that, and potentially an Outlook group as well. I need to update my infograph to show all those pieces, but basically we get what we see on the right-hand side through here. So what does that look like? What's the user experience? Well, there's a SharePoint framework web part that we've created that you deploy into your tenant, and then you can put it on any number of pages to allow requests to happen. And you can customize the web part to a great degree. You may not want to have all these choices available to people. You may want a very lean and simple that only has a couple of choices for them to fill out, and everything else is predefined and defaulted. So that's your choice as an administrator when you're deploying the solution as to how locked down you want to make this process and what that looks like. But ultimately, we've got the concept of site templates that live under divisions. And I'll take you through a live demo in a minute to show you that. Then we've got options as to whether we're going to create the teams, the groups, the sites, the OneNotes, the planner plans through that. And we leverage a lot of Microsoft PnP, which is an open source project Microsoft's had going for quite a few years now. And it's really started to mature. And one of the things it allows us to do is create templates of SharePoint sites. So I can create a SharePoint site the way I'd like it to be set up, capture a template out of that, and then when I create new teams and they're going to have a team site associated with them, I can have the same site columns, content types, lists, libraries, views, all that kind of stuff as part of that template applied to that as a starting point. Likewise, I might have a template for Planner to have particular buckets and tasks in there. I might have particular tabs and teams that I want set up a particular way. And the beauty of the solution is that the fields that we see on the form are dynamically generated. So if you want to extend and add new questions or things to fill it that's not part of the core solution, you don't have to break open the code behind the SharePoint framework web part. You just go and modify the content type, add some more columns to it, and it'll just live show up on the web part. So this is probably a good point here to flip over and actually show you what that looks like. So if I come in here, and I come to the home of this site here, we've actually got a number of web parts. I'll talk about the left-hand side with the sites web part in a minute, but this is the request web part. So I can choose a division. So we've got a couple of divisions in here. I'll go ahead and just use temporary demos as an example. Here we've got divisions with or without approval, so we can sort of test and demonstrate that. And then based on that division, I have a number of templates, and everything's driven through SharePoint lists. So you define when you deploy it out, what your divisions are, what your templates are, which divisions have which templates available to them. There's sort of a many-to-many relationship through there. I can actually use the more complex one here, which is the modern client site. So this is a modern team site with our unique PnP template applied to that. And then based on that template, we've got a number of questions that we're going to ask here. And we've left this very open with a lot of questions. I wouldn't typically see it deployed this way because we'd want to sort of lock this down. This will be a little bit too confusing to people. Things like the external sharing options, you probably want to bake into either the template or the division and not let people choose specific details in that, just particular template that's going to be shared or not shared from that perspective. I can call this webinar demo 2. I'd already done a demo 1 as a dry run through there. You know, we auto create the alias, we double check to make sure it exists. In fact, if I change that back to demo 1, you'll see it's complaining and saying, hey, that alias is already in use. I can either change my title or I can change my alias, but I got to do something to make it unique. So I'll make it number 2. And how do we want the site to be visible? So out of the box, Microsoft has a concept of public and private teams, where public teams, everybody can self-join. Private, you need to be invited into. We have an additional concept of hidden teams, and the idea there is that not only are they private that you need to join them, but they don't show up in any of these views here, where we're showing people available sites and teams that they could join. So it's basically a super secret team that, you know, to know about it, you need to be part of it. And then I've got options here. Do I want to create the team, the OneNote? Let's say yes on the planner as well. How do I want the external sharing set up? And things like this prefix drives off of things like the division and the external sharing features. So we've got a bunch of rules around that. So let me go ahead and submit that. So what this has done is it's submitted it into a logic app, and I'll show you that in a minute, that basically goes through the processing, figure out whether approval needs to happen, and then actually go provision all those resources. But while we're in the page here, let's have a look at what we've got on the web parts on the left here. So it's the same web part, just has different views on it. In fact, if I come back to the PowerPoint deck here, you know, we've got a tile view that can show icons and descriptions. We've got a simple list view. We've got an A to Z web part that makes it easy when you've got lots of teams through there. So I've got a couple of examples of that going on here. We've got the A to Z. We've got the list web part filtered down to a particular division. So this is only showing me my temporary demo sites. We actually have a runbook that runs that cleans these up periodically. So as I create these ones, after a couple of days go by, they drop off and get deleted out. We were doing a bunch of testing yesterday, so we've got a bunch of test ones in there as part of that. And I can see here's my, you know, ones that have been set up for external sharing as part of that as well. If I come to W, oh, I should have seen the webinar demo that I had created earlier. Let's just have a look at that and see if that comes up for me. Nope. I wonder if I deleted it afterwards. Oh, it's showing down here in the temporary. Oh, I think I'm not showing the temporary demos in there. That's why. So the demo 2 hasn't shown up yet because it's still going through the provisioning process. So let's let that run for a minute. I'm going to give you some more background on the technology side, and then we'll come back and have a look at that. So the first thing I mentioned was that we're using Logic Apps. So if you're not familiar with this, maybe you're familiar with Power Automate or Microsoft Flow for doing workflows. Logic App is basically the same thing, but it lives under Azure. It's got some real advantages from a Visual Studio and DevOps software development lifecycle. You know, the ability to deploy them. That's, in my opinion, nicer than Power Automate. Doesn't have the same sort of richness of approval. It says no built-in approval. I got to tweak that because they have added an approval process. It's still not nearly as sophisticated as what Power Automate has. And I'm going to talk about that in the roadmap, how we're doing sort of a hybrid where we can combine Logic Apps and Power Automate. The reason we don't use Power Automate across the board is you get into premium licensing, and we wanted to avoid that in the base solution. And then we're also using what's called Azure Automation. So if you're familiar with PowerShell, Azure Automation is a way to run PowerShell in the cloud. You don't need to manage VMs. Basically, there's a pool of VMs available in Azure, and they take care of that for you. So when your Runbook runs, it gets an available VM, runs it on it, and away it goes from there. It's super cost effective. You get 500 minutes of runtime free per month, and then it's 2 cents or 0.2 cents per minute after that. So it takes a lot of runtime to actually incur any sort of significant costs in there. So this is what the overall solution looks like. Let me just start up in the top left up here. Whoops. So this is our web part that I just filled out. So I filled in that form and said, hey, I'd like a new team with these criteria on it. And when that submitted, when I hit that submit button in the bottom of it, it was doing a post to a Logic app. So you can set up a Logic app that has a trigger on an HTTP post, and it basically takes everything that was submitted in that form and it becomes available as parameters in the Logic app workflow. So this workflow is basically responsible for starting the process. And we've gone away from having a single workflow. We've actually modularized them a bit. So there's one that validates from a security token point of view that we've got a valid token and we know who's submitted that request. We may spin out to a Power Automate workflow, or we may come straight down into here and just do the provisioning. So I'll dig into these workflows in a minute, but that'll give you a sense of what that looks like. And basically this bottom one here calls down to Azure Automation and runs this create site runbook. Historically, this solution actually started as a site provisioning before there were Microsoft Teams, and we've kind of extended and grown, but we still call it sites for a lot of what we're doing through here. But it basically has a couple of other runbooks that support it to go ahead and create the team, the SharePoint site collection, the OneNote, the planner if required, the group in Azure AD, all those pieces through there. So that's kind of how the solution all hangs together. And if we look at what gets deployed out in Azure in order to support that, this is a look at the resource group, and we've got all the various different elements in here. So we've got the submit form logic app. It's supporting logic apps in here. We've got the Azure Automation account that has its runbooks down here. We've got a bunch of connections for connecting to the different services that get used by the logic apps. And we've got a key vault that's used for the planner integration. I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Let me actually switch over to the live view of that. So if I come in here, this is basically the Azure portal that I took that screenshot from. So we can see all those same pieces through here. And what I've done is pulled up views of the different components in here. Now this is a weird thing. When I was doing a dry run yesterday with my staff, I realized that I'm actually seeing different designer experiences depending on who I'm logged in to. So this is sort of the historical design surface. I can click into these to expand these boxes and see the steps in the workflow through here. And this is logged in as my local admin in this tenant that I'm using for development. But if I flip over and I go to that exact same tenant, so I'm still hitting that same Envision IT Dev Tenant. These are the same logic apps in here. I'm just signed in as a different person through a guest account from my regular prod account. I actually see a different design surface in here. This is the newer, updated one. Don't ask me why. Maybe they're doing A/B testing, but it's kind of weird. So I actually like the new view here. I don't see as many steps in the view. I have to scroll up and down because there's a fair bit of white space in here. But as we come through here, it sort of expands out some of these loops and conditional logics in here. It makes it a little easier to understand what's going on from that point of view. So if we start up at the top, basically when a request is received, so the submit button is pressed on that form, it posts to this URL. And there's some security things that we do to make sure that that's properly authenticated through Azure AD. I'm not going to go into detail on that. I actually have a webinar last month that I did on this topic, and I've got some links in this one. I'll show you if you want to go back and see the details on that. But I can see the parameters and the steps that happen through as part of that. And I hide that over, I initialize a bunch of variables. I call out to that other logic app to say, hey, figure out if that's a valid bearer token and find out who the user was that submitted it. So wiring the security pieces in here. And basically coming down and saying, hey, now I want to create an item in a sites list that tracks this whole process. And I'll show you that site in a minute. It looks up in the division list, figures out if there's an approver required for that particular site request. If it's not required, just set the status. If it is required, how are we doing the approval? Are we going through logic apps, in which case it's going to send out an approval email, and get the results from that. If it's not, it's just going to set a flag in the SharePoint list, and the idea is to have a Power Automate workflow that picks up off of that. It says, hey, something just got submitted that needs to be approved. I'm going to go through my approval process. And the nice thing about doing the approvals in Power Automate is they don't have to go through email. It will send emails, but it will also send Teams messages. There's a whole approvals app you can install into your Teams client. So it becomes a really nice experience from that point of view. Once it comes through all that, at the bottom of all that, it basically says, hey, I've got a team ready to go. Call that other logic app to do the actual provisioning. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat. Bear with me a sec. Okay, so if I come down, this is the validate bearer token. I actually covered this one in the previous webinar. This is the actual provision site. So this one gets started by the other logic app saying, hey, I'm all done, I'm approved, I'm ready to go. And what do I need to do? Is it all set up properly? If not, no, just terminate out. But then go get the details of the team and the site. Is it already approved? Yep. So now I want to call out to Azure Automation. I actually want to run that PowerShell job that actually does the heavy lifting from there. Get the output from that, make sure it's finished. There's actually some retry logic in here where it delays and loops if it's not ready. We actually had a fair bit of grief in the previous version dealing with simultaneous runs, and PnP didn't deal with that well. So we actually built some logic on the PowerShell side to say, hey, let's only run one of these at a time, and let's do delays and loops to deal with that from that point of view. But at the end of all this, have a look and see if the site got created successfully. If it wasn't, send out a notification, and we have support in the solution to say, hey, send notifications out through email or send them out through Teams chats. I actually like the Teams chats approach. I mean, it is a team solution, and we should use Teams as part of that. And likewise, if it was successfully provisioned, same sort of thing, either an email or a chat, and provide the appropriate response from there. So that's how the logic app wires together. And if we come over back in here, we've got our Azure Automation account. In fact, I think I've got that one open down at the bottom. Oh, no, I don't. So let's dive into the Azure Automation side. And an automation account is basically a collection of runbooks, which are PowerShell scripts. So, I mean, this is the main script that does the main work, and it calls out to the helper one. You can put your own customizations in here. The idea is that if you keep all your customizations in this file here, we never deploy that as part of our ARM template deployment, so we won't overwrite any of your customizations if you were to pull down a newer version of our solution. So it's a nice way to compartmentalize things that are unique to that particular deployment versus stuff that are common to the solution as a whole. But if I look at that create site runbook, we can see that it completed at 12:16. That's actually the request that I just submitted. So let's have a look at that. I can go into that job. I can see the logs that are coming out from that. Oh, I got a couple of warnings in there. I think we have some retry logic around that, but we'll have to see whether that worked properly for us or not. But you can see all the details of the output coming out. There's a lot of noise in here as it's importing all these commandlets. You kind of have to keep scrolling down, loading more. I wish there was a way to just load the whole page through here. But we can see here now, okay, we successfully created the team. We turned off the external sharing. We set the default sharing link to existing access, which for some reason Microsoft doesn't let you set it as a tenant level. So I like that we can set it for each site that we create. And continuing on, setting up the OneNote, doing the planner work here, creating the planner. There's some grief there in terms of Microsoft not providing the right security for their planner APIs. I'll talk about that in a minute. And basically finishes off through there. So there's our whole provisioning. So if we come back to here, and if you refresh this page now, so there's our demo webinar demo 2 that we just asked for. So it's all fully created. I can control click that, launch into a new tab, bring up that team site from there. Now there's some more things that we need to do. We don't have our PnP template fully set up to customize this entirely the way I want. We want a different home page on here, so there's some edits we need to do this, and we want to avoid that sort of thing where every time you create a team, you have to edit things to tweak them the way you want. Like over here, we have a link to conversations, which actually takes me to the Microsoft Outlook group for this. We don't ever use those conversations, we use Teams. So we always need to come in here and say, hey, I want to get rid of that particular link, and I want to add in a link to the team instead through that. That's the sort of thing that we want to put into the PnP template, and it's all there. We just haven't had a chance to tweak our template the way we want from that point of view. But if I jump over to that team, it's going to try and force it to open in Teams. I don't want to do that because I'm presenting in Teams right now. Let's just go ahead and use the web app. The super speedy web app. Good chance to have a quick sip of water. Okay. And down at the bottom here, here's my new webinar demo 2. We just created a general channel in it. You could add your own scripts in there to add additional channels if you had a structure to how you want that team to look. We've got our files tab here that points me over to SharePoint. Oh, it's still actually creating things. There's a lot of asynchronous processes in the background with Microsoft. So even though you say create this team and it says I'm done, sometimes you need to wait for that to come back. We actually need to add some code into our template to remove the wiki tab. I'm not actually a big fan of wikis. I prefer to use OneNote. So we added a OneNote tab in here because we turned the OneNote option on through there. So that links to the general section in OneNote that corresponds to the channel we've got here, which is sort of a best practice that we do from that point of view. I think that one's not going to work either because the OneNote is actually in the SharePoint site as well. I'll see if the planner is actually provisioned yet. So it should have created a Microsoft Planner plan for me and wired this tab up into that as part of that as well. I mean, one thing you might want to do is put a delay in the notification, pause that logic app for an hour or something like that. Just let all the dust settle before you let people know that their team is ready to use, because even though Microsoft says it's ready, it's not actually really ready as part of that. So that gives you a sense of what that looks like. In fact, if we come back to the SharePoint site, you'll notice that we've got different libraries in here that came as part of the template. So if I come into my shared documents, I've got some base folders that we've created in there. There's some site columns and content types that we've got in there as well. So we've structured some things in there the way we like to organize our client sites from that point of view. The other thing we tend to do on the home page is we always add in our extranet user manager web part that allows me to easily create external groups and share just the SharePoint site, not the whole team, with external people. That's another thing we need to default in as part of our template through here. Okay. Let's come back to my deck here. Okay, so I mentioned I've got everything up on GitHub. Let's go have a look at that. So if we come into GitHub, so if you just navigate straight to the EUM sites, you end up at the master tree. I haven't merged things back into the master branch, but the link I gave in PowerPoint deck points to the V5 branch, and that's the current branch that we're working as through here. So if you've navigated through, just make sure you're on the V5 branch, and you'll see that updates obviously were made quite recently on that. So what do we have in here? I'm going to talk more about the ARM template generator and deployer side of things, and ARM template. This is how we actually do the deployment. But you'll see in here is all the PowerShell code. So that create site and the sites helper, we've published all the code out through there. We've also published PowerShell scripts that allow you to deploy the solution. So it will actually, create the lists that are needed for the solution in a site collection that you've created to host the solution in, to basically get that all wired up and ready to go from that point of view. Now we've got some starting template files. So if we've left a sample customizations file that you can modify the way you want from there, and there's some starting points for other pieces from there. So there is a technical guide that I need to refresh with, it kind of explains all the components in here and how it all hangs together. Just working on that. I need to get the install together first and get everything up in GitHub. We've done that. Now it's time to circle back on the documentation. So we'll have an updated version of that white paper, if you've looked at that before, up and available on the site over the next couple of days. Okay. Oh, I'm back at the master branch. Sorry, I want to be back at V5. Okay, let's leave the ARM template side for a minute because I want to give the background and context on that. So the first piece, is as part of this refresh, which honestly, goes back to last fall. We've been working on this for a long time. We had a number of security audits from clients who had very reasonable issue with the fact that we were storing credentials in Key Vault and we were using that to authenticate to PNP. And what that meant was that those were user credentials. You needed those user accounts to have multi-factor authentication turned off on them. That's a super bad idea. I'm dead set against that. And the problem was in the old PNP, it didn't have great support for service principals that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So the new PNP Core SDK launched in March of this year, and it's designed to work with Microsoft 365. It's compliant with .NET 5, which is the new .NET Core version, as well as .NET Standard 2.0, fully cross-platform. So you should be able to run this on Linux and other platforms as well as part of that. And it basically provides what they call a unified object model. So it eliminates the need for you to understand which API to use in which scenario. Do I go through the Graph API, the SharePoint API? Do I make REST calls, CSOM calls? The SDK handles all that for you. And part of what we had a lot of grief with, I alluded to this earlier, was actually retry logic and things failing and having to retry them. They've put support right into the PNP to deal with a lot of that. Now we still have a lot of retry loops in our open source. We haven't gone through a reconciliation to say, hey, do we still need that, or does new PNP Core take care of that for us? It's probably safest just to leave that in there. Things like service throttling, where you hit the APIs too quickly, Microsoft will actually throttle that back because it is a shared service. There are other tenants on the same hardware with you out in the Microsoft Cloud. So if you start to overuse your service, they'll actually throttle you back and start to deny requests through there. So having retry is very important as part of that. It still includes the templating engine that I was talking about, where we can capture and apply templates to the SharePoint site. So that's super important. The big thing was the better support for service principals, so we can improve the security. So let's talk more about that side for a minute here. I've already gone through the Logic App workflow, so I'll just leave that and the Azure Automation as background in the slide deck. I want to talk more about the security best practices, because this was a big driver for this update. So one part of it was when somebody submitted a request through our request web part previously, what happened was it just wrote directly to the SharePoint list. What that meant was that everybody that was able to make a request needed to contribute access to that SharePoint list. And that also is a bad idea from a security point of view. So if I come back to my tenant here, oh, wrong one. And I look at my main site. So this sites list I mentioned before is kind of the engine behind the whole process. Every request that gets made gets written to this list, and everything about that request. Did I want a OneNote, a planner, a team? What was its purpose? What's its site URL? All that metadata is stored in this list. So this is a super important list for managing the process. And it's also used for those web parts, like the A to Z web parts that I was showing you, to be able to list out the lists that are available there. So if we come back to this list here, having everybody in your organization have contributed access to this list is a bad idea. I mean, people could come in and delete items and change columns on items. You really don't want them doing that. You only want them interacting through the request web part itself. So how do we do that? Well, what we did was we said, hey, let's have the web part actually connect straight to the Logic App. So it doesn't write to the SharePoint list, it writes to the Logic App, and then the Logic App uses its own secure connection to write to the list. So nobody needs access to the list. In fact, you can make it a hidden list if you don't want people to even see it at all. And basically, when the web part talks to the Logic App, that's all validated by Azure AD. So there's a bearer token that gets passed across. Microsoft takes care of part of that to validate that it's a properly signed token and things are secure from that point of view. And then that sub Logic App that I was showing you before goes a little further to parse out and figure out who actually made the request. So we don't need the rights to the sites list. That's a really important part. The other part is, for the most part, this A to Z web part actually uses search to search the sites. So when I'm back on this page here, and I want to see all the sites or all the teams that I have access to, we're not actually searching that list. What we're doing is actually going into the sites themselves. So if I come back down into the demo site that we just created, and I look at the site contents in this list, or in this site, Sorry, my browser is just taking a minute to catch up here. We have this list called site metadata. It's only ever got one item in it. And basically what it has is a snippet of the metadata that was in that main sites list embedded into the site itself. And you might say, well, why are you doing that? You're scattering, this list data all across all these different site collections. That's actually on purpose. The point is that there's site columns and content types behind this, and we can light up search crawl to say, hey, when I'm on this page here and I want to see all the teams that me as the signed in user has access to, just go execute a search query. Go find all those list items across all those sites, and SharePoint will already take care of the security trimming for me. It'll only give me the sites that I have access to, so it gives me a very quick way to give me a security trimmed view of all the sites. And you can start to add additional metadata in that and filter it down. Like, I only want to see the temporary demos or a particular division. You might want to have this web part deployed out to division landing sites, and you would see all the collaboration teams underneath that division, but it would only show the teams that that person who signed in has access to. So again, security is super important, and user experience is part of that as well. And then lastly was the actual PowerShell side. So this was back to the PnP side of things where, in the past we had user credentials. We were securely storing them in Key Vault, but we had to turn off MFA as part of that. We didn't want to do that anymore. It's really bad practice from a security point of view. So what we should be doing is using what's called a run as account in Azure Automation. And this is basically a service principal that lives in Azure AD. So there's a certificate associated with it, and Azure Automation takes care of registering those certificates and having the private and public keys appropriately stored in the right places. So it simplifies all that for you. And then you basically apply permissions to that service principal in the graph in Azure AD, and it's able to do things through the rights defined to that. And it's not going through regular user credentials, it's using the certificates, which is a more secure way of doing it. And there's no MFA needed as part of that. So if you're not familiar with service principals, I do talk about it in my previous webinars. So you can go back to that to see more detail. But it's a good link that kind of explains, each Azure AD application. So that Azure Run As account is considered an application that's registered in Azure AD. And then as you apply permissions to it, either in its home tenant, or you can actually apply permissions in another tenant as well if you wanted to. In our scenario, we're just kind of doing the left-hand side here. That's where we get the service principals that have access to resources. So, you can do this manually yourself. You can create a self-signed certificate, and I talked in that previous webinar on how to do that. But basically, Azure Automation takes care of all this for you. And then you just assign the permissions that you want, and that is used to authenticate. The new PnP core actually not only supports this, but strongly encourages this certificate model of permissioning from that perspective. So then the last piece from a technical point of view was packaging all this up. Getting this deployed out was a real challenge, particularly the logic apps, using the out-of-the-box templates that come out of the Azure portal and trying to deploy those to another tenant doesn't work very well. So, we wanted to improve that experience and make that much easier. So we've built PowerShell scripts that will generate the right template and facilitate the deployment of it. We've done some parameterization around that. Again, I talk more about this in my other session, but basically, allowing you to define parameters at the ARM template level and then mapping those to parameters in the logic apps and the Azure Automation. So basically, instead of exporting from the Azure portal, you run this ARM template generator PowerShell, and we've included this in the GitHub as well. Even though you don't need it for the team's provisioning, it's there for you to use in general. And basically, you've got a definition file that defines how that process works. And then instead of just deploying the ARM template through the Azure portal, you deploy it with this ARM template deployer, which is what you can use for our team's provisioning to deploy that out. And it does all the wiring up the parameters, creating the run as account properly, deploying the runbook scripts that don't go as part of the default ARM template. The only thing you need to do is grant consent to the API from a permissions point of view, and you're all set. So I do have links here to the secure development webinar that I did in April and the software development lifecycle one that I did at the beginning of May. It goes into much more depth on those topics. So I encourage you to check that out from that point of view. But let's actually go over and have a look at what that deployment process looks like. because I kind of breezed over this when I was in here. So in this ARM template generator and deployer are those two PowerShell scripts. I talk about how you can use them in general for your projects, not just for this Teams provisioning. So check out that other webinar and you can see how to leverage those in your projects and even your Azure DevOps and continuous integration pipelines as part of that. And then this ARM template folder gets created by the generation part of the process, and it basically has all the artifacts related to it. So it's got the actual ARM template. Now this isn't the default one that gets exported from Azure. It's the modified one that's been tweaked to work properly. So there's a config JSON that drives how that tweaking works, and then there's a parameters file that goes with that template. Now what the generator does is it also exports out all the runbooks from the resource group that you're targeting for templating, and it actually dumps out regular, sort of generic ARM templates for each of the artifacts in that resource group. So each of the runbooks here, the logic apps are all created as JSON files in here as well. This becomes really important from a source control point of view. So if you're modifying your logic apps, for example, there is version history in the Azure Portal, but the better approach is to put it into source control, to check these files into GitHub like I have here, or into Git or DevOps, whatever your source control of preference is. You can actually difference these files. They are text files, so you can see sort of the code view of the logic app. It's a little confusing to look at, but you can see the triggers in here. You see the different actions and steps. And if you were to compare this between versions, it becomes immediately obvious what somebody changed. Maybe they tweaked one action or one step in the workflow. You'll see that jump out at you when you look at those differences through there. So it's a nice way to better manage the source control related to your project. And again, you don't have to just use it for Teams provisioning. You can use it more broadly for your projects as a whole. Okay, up towards the top of the hour. Let's talk a bit more about roadmap, and then we've got a few minutes left. We can circle back to go deeper on any questions or specific topics that we want to. So I already mentioned this. In fact, we've got a bunch of this built. We just haven't packaged it into the solution, is to allow us to use the Power Automate approval process. So if you're not familiar with the approval app, if I come over to my Teams here, so I've actually added it in through, you can add additional apps into your Teams interface, and you can add the Power Automate approvals as part of that. And basically what this gives me is a received and sent overview of what's happening from an approvals point of view. So it's not unique just to the Teams provisioning. We can see we've got some publishing approvals that we've got going on. We've got some employee self-service stuff that we were demoing for a previous webinar. It all shows in the queue through here. And these approvals show up as chat messages through my activity feed. I can improve them in place. I don't know if I've actually got one here for, oh, here's a site request one. So that's actually a requested one. So it shows me that, hey, this was requested by me actually. It's still pending. I can put some comments in here and I can either approve or reject it. And once I've done the approval on it, I'm not actually going to do it because I think I've deleted these list items since we did this. This goes back a fair bit in time. But if I pick another one that's been approved, you can see that the card has a different view on it. It doesn't actually let me approve it because it's already been approved, and it shows me exactly when that was approved. And I actually get the same experience when I get these Outlook actionable cards through my Outlook experience as well. So the approval is going to go simultaneously to both Teams and to Outlook, and people can choose. If I like working in Outlook through email, I can approve it through there, and I get the same sort of actionable card as part of that experience. If I prefer to work in Teams, I can do it through here. So it's kind of a best of both worlds scenario. And there's different ways, as I mentioned, this could be wired up. I mean, I've got it built right now that it triggers off of the list change, which is a little bit of duct tape and binder twine. You're having this change something in a list, which triggers something over here that changes something else in a list that triggers this one here. It all hangs together. It's not really the best architecture. We're going through these tricks just to avoid some Microsoft licensing on the Power Automate side. The better way to do it would be to license this as a premium workflow and just have this do a post straight to the workflow, and then have this do a post straight to the logic app from there, and eliminate these triggers on the SharePoint list. It'd be a better enterprise integration from there. I mean, you could build the whole thing as a Power Automate. I kind of like having it as a logic app. It just works better. You know, we can do all these same sort of things, but I can't package the Power Automate up as an ARM template. I can't make it easy from a deployment and a DevOps point of view. So I really like that feature of logic apps. The next piece we were thinking about, this is actually from a client request, is to bring in Azure AD access reviews. If you're not familiar with them, they do require a premium P2 license. Not for everybody in your organization. Basically, anybody who's going to perform an access review would need that. And there's a link here to a Microsoft Docs article that talks more about it. It's not about governance of the teams and the sites that you're creating. It's governance around the users that are coming into those. So it's really an identity governance process. And where our clients most particularly see that is around the partners and customers, sort of the external identity side of things. So if you want to say, hey, you know, if a team was provisioned to allow external guests into the SharePoint site, for example, which is a common scenario, we do that ourselves with our client teams that we create for our clients. And we want some governance to say, hey, if I've invited in a customer to that SharePoint team site, maybe we should have an access review every 30 days, every 90 days to say, hey, does that external user still need access to that site? When did they last log in? Does somebody need to review and extend or approve that? And if they don't, that guest user gets removed and no longer has access in there. So that's another piece that we're looking at, is to just add some customizations in to wire in through the graph, the setting up of those access reviews. A bunch of other features that we're working on for different clients. Fairly simple one that, you know, honestly we should have had their way back, which is just the ability to request additional team owners. So when I'm on the team request form here, you know, I've picked a particular team and I want to set that up. You know, do I have the ability to add other people as owners to that team? Because what's going to happen when I submit this, it's going to make me, as the person that submitted it, the owner of that team, but maybe there's 2 or 3 or 4 other people that should be an owner of that. So just adding another people picker box that you can add in those additional people. Some additional features around the team prefixes. So when we're back on the temporary demos here, you know, we've got that prefix that's defined off of the division. You know, can we have that defined off of the site template instead, or in addition to? You know, can we get more sophisticated in those prefix rules that we have in there? This is also very much for external users. So if I choose that, hey, I'm going to make this available to, say, existing guests, or maybe even new and existing guests, probably not the anyone, because that would conflict with the whitelist idea. But the idea being that we could have a field in here where we define what are the whitelisted domains. So what email domain do I need to belong to as a guest to come into this team? Because maybe this team is a client one and we only want people from that client's email domain to be able to be invited in as a guest. So Azure AD B2B supports that, just making it a little easier to manage that as part of the request process. Back to the governance side of thing, you know, putting in a collaboration end date. You know, how long do you want this team to be around for, and what should happen when that date comes along? You know, does a workflow kick off that asks if it needs to be extended, or the site needs to be deleted or archived? You know, getting that full lifecycle idea in there. And related to the owner's concept, you know, if it is being externally shared, there's actually an Azure AD guest inviter role that if we set it up this way, where we say, hey, it could be new and existing guests, we want to make sure that the person requesting this team has the ability to invite new users into Azure AD. And that's done by having this guest inviter role assigned to that requester. You know, and then coming into sensitivity labeling, probably should also be thinking about retention labeling as well. You know, is this a general confidentiality? Is it super secret? Is it somewhere in between? You know, and things like Azure Information Protection and Rights Management Services can be applied to the resulting team to do things like encrypt content that's in there and provide additional controls around there. So really, you know, extending the governance features of it around that. We're at 12:55, so I probably don't have time to go back. I don't know if we've got any questions there, Logan. Doesn't look like we have any outstanding ones. Let's just circle over to our wrap-up points from here. So key thing, we've updated to use the latest PnP PowerShell. So that's the Microsoft preferred path from a supported point of view. They have deprecated the old versions of PnP, so strongly encouraging moving across to the new. And we've updated all of our scripts because there were some commandlet changes and things that needed to get tweaked as part of that. The improved security, the elimination of any need for user accounts with MFA disabled, that's a big deal for some of our clients, and honestly, it should be a big deal for every client. Everybody should have MFA turned on. Ideally, you should have conditional access policies with Azure AD at least Premium 1 on your tenant. If you don't, you're setting yourself up for ransomware, for all sorts of nasty things, and cybercrime is certainly on the rise. So you need to be looking at those sorts of things. It's all packaged up in an ARM template, so the deployment gets much easier. Actually, yeah, I did have a script that I was running here, although I didn't successfully get through it. I mean, this is the ARM template deployer script. It basically goes through the various different steps. We don't have time to get into the details of it, but it deploys the ARM template. It it sets up the automation connection and the certificates for the run as account. So it creates the service principal and the self-signed certificate. So there's a bunch of things it needs to do to get that all ready. It deploys out the modules that you need in the Azure Automation. So all those supporting PnP modules and Azure modules get deployed as part of that. It actually imports the Runbook. So when you deploy the ARM template, it actually doesn't deploy the PowerShell as part of that. So this actually does that as part of that. So there's a bunch of steps that deployment does as part of that. And we've actually simplified the architecture. There's no API anymore. The web part just posts directly to the Logic app. We've modularized and simplified things just to make it easier to understand from that point of view. There's a bunch of resources here. We've got the white paper. As I mentioned, we're going to be updating that in the next few days. We'll send out an email to everybody off the webinar for that. We've got the past webinar sessions. I've done a TSPUG session around this. We've got the open source article related to that. So lots of content there. And then just from an upcoming point of view, next week I'm going to be doing a co-presented webinar actually with a partner of ours on managing complex projects with Microsoft 365. So kind of a case study going through not just the governance stuff, but how do you effectively use Microsoft 365 and external sharing and all those features for big complex projects. Going to get into more of the out of the box versus our extranet user manager from an unstructured to structured external sharing in July. And then later in July, there's actually some cool new features around self-registration and stuff that you can do out of the box without our product in Azure AD. So I'm going to talk about those features as part of that. So with that, I think we're basically at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hope it was a helpful session. I know there's a lot of content there. I will follow up with an updated white paper, looking to get a sort of an installation video together for it as well to help you with on that process. But if you want some help deploying this into your organization, by all means, reach out. Logan can work with you to figure out, happy to do sort of a 1 hour consulting to get you started. And if it needs to go deeper than that, you'd like some professional services around there, happy to help you from that perspective as well. So with that, I'll bid you adieu. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for joining. Bye now.